It's my privilege to introduce our speaker this evening. We're so pleased that you're with us. Dr. Ingrid Mattson is the inaugural London and Windsor Community Chair in Islamic Studies at Huron University College in London. Dr. Mattson was born in Kitchener and studied philosophy and fine arts at the University of Waterloo. She earned her PhD in Islamic Studies at the University of Chicago in 1999, so Ingrid, we share this alma mater for our doctoral work. I graduated there in 1984 myself. Her scholarly work often explores the relationship between Islamic law and society, and particularly engages gender and leadership issues in contemporary Muslim communities. Her book, The Story of the Quran, Its History and Place in Muslim Life, is a highly regarded and well-utilized text. Recently, Dr. Mattson returned to Canada from the United States, where she had served as the director of the Duncan Black Macdonald Center for the Study of Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations, and where she also was a professor of Islamic Studies at Hartford Seminary in Hartford, Connecticut. She founded the Islamic Chaplaincy Program at Hartford, which was the first such program in the United States. Dr. Mattson has also served as the first woman president of the Islamic Society of North America in the United States. John Brennan, the Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama for Homeland Security, has described Professor Mattson as a voice for tolerance and diversity. We're honored to have her with us this evening and to have her address us along the theme of rooting a Canadian Muslim identity. Welcome, Dr. Mattson, and we look forward to you.
Thank you, Mark Sluice, for that warm welcome. Yes, John Brennan. We had to note John Brennan. That's for all of those of you may be watching who thought it was a travesty that I came here tonight. For other audiences, being endorsed by John Brennan is not considered to be a really high honor. But I like him. I think he's a sincere person. It's really just such a great pleasure to come here tonight, to be here on the night of the inauguration of your prayer room. I'm excited about the Muslim Studies program. I've known about its evolution over the last few years. Naveen and I have been in touch about what it might look like and what it could be, and I'm really impressed with the work you've done, Professor Naveen Ritta has done in this regard. I'm also happy to see other friends and colleagues who have contributed so much to Islamic Studies. Kathy Bullock, Professor Laurie Silvers is here tonight. The second edition of my Quran book is just out. Well, if you order it, you'll get it in another week or two. And I added some of Laurie Silver's tafsir, Quran interpretation, in that second edition. So you'll have to get that. I'll have to send you a copy. Really grateful to you for your wisdom and insight, Laurie. My former student, Amjad Tarsin, who is a chaplain here, I was so happy when I moved to Canada that a number of my students also made the hijrah to the safe and peaceful land, usually, of Canada also. So I visited my former student, Sami Mutawalli, who's the imam of the main mosque in Ottawa now as well, and doing a great job there. So it's really exciting to come back to Canada. I've been away for over 20 years. And so I feel in some ways a little awkward being the one coming here today and talking about rooting a Canadian Muslim identity. Or maybe I'm the right person to talk about it because I myself am trying to figure out what that really means. And as much or maybe more from an American Muslim perspective as from the perspective of just being a Muslim. American Muslims have a completely different dynamic and different challenges and different resources for engaging with Islam and understanding our identity. Americans also, I think, approach religious identity and public expressions of religion differently. I also learned since I came back, as I was telling Lori, I need to calm down a little bit, lower my energy now that I'm back in Canada. It's just a little bit, it's a different environment. And so, so I'm trying to figure that out as well. But I think the fact that someone who has roots in Canada going back to the early 19th century is trying to understand what's Canadian about Canada is a lesson in and of itself. I think it's something that is a really important part of the discussion as we go through some of these issues tonight. So I'll begin, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, and peace and blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad. And that's part of me staking my claim as a Canadian Muslim. One of the things that I won't do is to say that any space that we're in needs to become a space devoid of God. I think to be a Muslim means that if anything else goes by the wayside, I have to be able to be authentic in that respect. And so, also I've noticed it's a little easier in the United States to be that than in Canada. So it's very easy in the United States if I'm speaking to someone to say at the end of my conversation with them, well, God willing, we'll meet again. Or instead of just bless you, to say God bless you. There was a great episode of This Is That, about this kind of, anyone hear that on CBC radio? About you not saying God bless you. It's very funny. Trying not to impose our religion on people. And if you say God bless you, then you're making the assumption that they believe in God, and you're really imposing your view of the divine on that person. Of course, it's a program that takes these things to an absurd level, but it reflects a reality, like any satire and any absurdity. It reflects a reality in our society that we're really trying to struggle with. Am I imposing my view of God, of religion, of what is proper, what is right, of what a woman should be if I walk out of my house with this scarf on my head, by the way, which came from Tibetan Buddhists, so, you know, does that make it better if it came from Tibetan Buddhists? I'm sort of acknowledging religious pluralism. If I wore it on my neck, it'd be okay, but not on my head. You know, there's a lot of conversations that happen that are, I think, upsetting to people, that are offensive to others, and that sometimes approach the point of absurdity, but really dig down to many deeper issues that we need to concern ourselves with. This title, the title of this topic, Rooting a Canadian Muslim Identity, I really like the image of rooting identity. I like it because I like to garden, and also because I was a tree planter. And there's a real Canadian experience for you, is the university student who goes tree planting, Northern Ontario and Northern British Columbia. One of the things I learned when I was a tree planter was that you need soil to root something. So tree planting in Northern Ontario was quite easy, because in Northern Ontario, when they cut trees down for logging, they tended to select a certain number of trees, but among the bush. So you would leave many of the trees, and you'd leave, even if you took down most of the trees, you would still have brush and shrubs and other growth. When you go to British Columbia, when I was there, the practice generally was clear cutting. And when you clear cut in a mountain, what happens as soon as it rains is everything washes away, including the soil. It was the most frustrating job I ever had, because I was wandering around the mountain with bags full of these seedlings on my hips, seedlings with rooted plugs around this long, and not being able to find, going around the mountain with my shovel, digging, and just finding stone, not finding any dirt more than maybe an inch or an inch and a half. You couldn't root these trees because there was no dirt left. That's what clear cutting does. And for a long time, that remained for me a metaphor about cultures that have been devastated by modernity, by imperial powers, by colonial powers. When I see, in this case, Muslims in particular, across the world, trying to build healthy communities, trying to plant roots, trying to grow, very often it's happening in places where society, culture, their institutions have been clear-cut. And under the years, decades that followed, colonialism and then ethnic nationalism and all the ideologies of the 20th century, everything washed away. And people are trying to replant, trying to rebuild, but there's no soil there. And they're making a good effort in many cases, many sincere people, but it's really, things are withering. Things are withering because they do not have a healthy soil, a healthy environment. We'll talk a little bit more about Muslims in other parts of the world later in my talk, because it's relevant to the Canadian Muslim identity as well. But what about Canada? Is this a rich soil? Is this a healthy soil in which to plant Islamic roots or Muslim roots? Is it a hostile climate? I'm really impressed by how many people came out today. I have a very positive and optimistic view of Canadian Islam because so many Muslims came out in this weather tonight. So that shows to me that you are hardy and you will survive in this culture and this climate. But you know, the environment needs to be good. If we're talking about a Canadian Islam, we have two sides of the puzzle, at least, two sides of the identity issue that need to be healthy and that need to work together to allow for healthy growth. I also think, when I think of rooting, I think of something that's very important in the Islamic tradition as Muslims have moved across the world into different environments. Environments that were radically different in terms of their economy and their culture, their way of life, their social structure. The life of a 7th century tribal person, even though the Meccans at the time of the Prophet Muhammad themselves were sedentary primarily and not nomads anymore, still their lifestyle in the broader Middle East, what we would now call the Middle East, what we could say North Africa and Western Asia more properly, their lifestyle was really a minority lifestyle. Most people were living and had lived for a long time in cities. Islam should be able to survive and grow and flourish in an urban environment, and in urban environments that were religiously diverse, that were culturally diverse and distinct. That's from the very earliest period of Islam. So for that, for religious diversity, for cultural diversity, for mobility, migration, the transmission of ideas and technology, for those things to present a challenge to Muslim identity is a bit of a puzzle. Why should it be a challenge? I think before we get deeper into what it means to be a Muslim or what it means to be a Canadian, which we need to explore in order to understand the possibilities for a Canadian Muslim identity, we really need to look at the issue of identity itself. Identity is probably one of the most commonly employed or engaged terms used by the Muslim community in the West, in North America. We want youth to retain their Muslim identity. We want to encourage Muslim identity. It's really important that we understand our identity. Now that's quite interesting because if I look at centuries of scholarly texts and writing, writings by Muslims about their priorities, I don't see that much about identity. This phrase, Muslim identity, is not something that we see appear or as a focus of attention. You're concerned with the law, you're concerned with ethics, with behavior. But identity is not something that is such a concern. And it appears to us then that this is something that is eminently modern, the focus on identity. Now, what is it about identity? Why is it so important? The reality is that so many of our conversations, and by our, I mean Muslims who live in this time, devolve into identity politics. Let me just, I think I'll just give you an example of this from my Twitter account a few days ago. So this followed I tweeted out a link that gave some background information on the rich cultural heritage of Mali, and especially their musical tradition. I mean, Mali really is the mother, you know, the mother of the blues. The Malian tradition of singing, of guitar, what became the guitar, string instrument, drums, the beats, the rhythms. There's a lot of evidence that it was people from that area of the world who were enslaved who brought it over to the Americas, and it was the enslaved Africans who brought these rhythms and sounds into the Americas, and this became the basis of blues and rock music and everything else. It's really the mother of modern music. And so I was sharing that information and getting a response, a very angry response, from at least one person about how this was, who considered this to be somehow a justification of French intervention in Mali. Of course, one really had nothing to do with the other. I didn't say anything about the French intervention. I was simply talking about, we know before the French intervened, whether we support it or don't, there has been a vicious attack by extremists on traditional Islamic culture in Mali, and by people who are doing it in the name of Islam, cleansing Mali of these accretions to a pure, what they view as a pure Islamic culture. And so the person who was responded to me said things like this: why don't you pay homage to the Muslims who civilized the backwards and savage Europeans? And then he says this: the white man has always been a thief who stole ideas and patented for himself. And then he goes and says, you, okay, first get out of our countries, then we will get out of yours. Now this person, if you look it up, he lives in the UK, all right? And his tag ends in 90, so I have a feeling he was born in 1990. A young man who lives in the UK, Muslim man. And then, of course, we have the very bizarre statement about what did white people eat before the coming of the potato? Now, does that confuse you? I point these out to you not to say that there's, you know, everyone's absurd, but there's some themes in there that are interesting. The theme of you stole our heritage on the one hand, so there's a kind of resentment. What you claimed as good is really ours. We are not, once you were the backward people and we were the advanced people. So there's this sense of somehow justification for the state that Muslims are in. There's an immediate shift into issues not about Muslims and religiosity and what's allowed or not, prohibited or lawful, but about the West. Immediately it comes into a discussion about the West versus Muslims. And then the West becomes white people. That is such a common chain of justification, argumentation that we face in this time. It shows that the levels of identity that Muslims are dealing with are really problematic. Now, I have to say this, that anger at the West is not unique to colonized or post-colonized Muslim people. Let me read a quote. "The mixing of the Enlightenment and nationalism throughout the Western-dominated 19th century produced something that swelled like a planetary boil because a handful of empires dominated everywhere." Now, the person who says this is John Ralston Saul, who's one of Canada's most beloved and prominent philosophers, who also happened to have just, whose wife was the Governor General of Canada for many years, and he himself is held up as a epitome of Canadian values, descended from white Scottish ancestors. Yet he himself identifies, especially 19th century Western colonialism, and his emphasis is on colonialism in the New World, in Canada in particular, as part of a planetary boil. So the combination of the imposition of Enlightenment ideology and nationalism, especially ethnic nationalism. Of course, we know that in the 19th century that a very small part of the world, that white European Christians at one point in the 19th century dominated 85% of the globe, had sovereignty over 85% of the globe. So that kind of anger or frustration at what happened, at the results of what happened, I think are rational. They're reasonable if they're understood and analyzed in their historical context. The problem I have with it is that when that is conflated with religious identity, when it is that kind of reasonable responses or anger at being colonized becomes a kind of agenda that is adopted as part of the whole agenda of the religious community. So Islam becomes reduced to a political agenda. And many of us have seen this, especially in the latter part of the 20th century. There's an extreme emphasis on political identity in mosque speeches and in the discourse of the American and Canadian Muslim community. I think it still exists to a large extent. And that is because so many of the people who came, or who are Muslims in these countries, came from countries that were colonized. And so they brought with them that outrage. Now, Graham Fuller, who kind of escaped from the United States to teach in Canada, how many of you know Graham Fuller? He's been teaching at the University of British Columbia. I don't know if he's still there, but he was the Deputy National Security Advisor in the United States, so like the second in command to what John Brennan has been for many years. And he was also the station chief in Kabul for many years. Graham Fuller wrote a great book called A World Without Islam. And in it, he talks about, he does a kind of thought experiment. Well, Islam is blamed as the cause of sort of anti-Western feeling in Muslim countries. Let's imagine that Islam didn't exist. Would there still be anti-Western feeling? And in fact, he shows that very clearly there would be and there has been. In fact, the first revolt against the Roman empire, the Roman Christian Empire, came on the part of Syrian Christians who wanted to keep Syriac as their language of their ritual language, and who resented the hegemony of Rome, of the new Western Church on the Eastern Church. That can help us understand even today why Syria once again has turned east to the support of Russia, as opposed against Western intervention in Syria. So anti-Westernism is not something that is embedded in Islam. It is a rational response to Western intervention and hegemony that is it's a story that goes back as far as Alexander the Great and Alexander's extension of the power of imperial Rome and Greece to the east. But there's another issue that Graham Fuller raises, and he says, if this is the case, it's also the case that many people across the world have been colonized and have been oppressed, and many of them have simply succumbed to it. But we see that Islam is particularly successful in rallying people in its name against this kind of political domination. And he says, because it's true that Islam is a religion that enjoins justice and that encourages people to fight against injustice. And that is one of the reasons why Muslims have been particularly prominent as a group in rallying against injustice. So we understand this and we see this. The problem that I have with this is that none of this really is the same as Islam, except to the extent that Islam does say that we should fight injustice. Now, the reason why I think American Muslims have been able to extract themselves a little bit from simply making American Islam into an anti-Western discourse is for one simple reason, and that is because approximately 25% of the American Muslim community is African American. And the priorities of African Americans in terms of justice and seeking justice and identifying what is not just are different than immigrants. Because African Americans are looking at their life in terms of the structural injustices within the country, within the United States, but as Americans. They see an economic system, they see a legal system that has resulted in the highest incarcerated population in the world in terms of percentages, and that African Americans are incarcerated in far greater numbers than their percentage of the population. They see all around them not only their history of oppression within the United States, but also current legislation and practices. So they were the ones that turned the question around to their immigrant brothers and sisters and said, wait a minute, you talk about injustice, but you ignore the injustices being done to us. You talk about injustice, yet you ignore the fact that there are people in your own community who are contributing and participating in systems that oppress us, who are participating in economic systems in the inner city that take advantage of poor African Americans. For example, opening up, immigrants. This is, of course, Spike Lee classically, showed this dynamic of immigrants coming into the inner city, opening up little shops, and kind of dealing with doing a kind of number with the food stamps so that they would be able to take the money from the poor people who would then use this money or the food stamps for alcohol and for other things that were not to the benefit of their family. If there are Muslims in the community, yes, not good Muslims, but there's still Muslims in the community who are contributing to that system, why are we not turning our anger and wrath against injustice to that issue? And so I think for American Muslims, African Americans really elevated the issue of justice and generalized it and made it a universal principle and brought it out of simply identity politics, the West versus Islam, the West versus Muslims, colonialism, imperialism, and really made us look more deeply at systematic injustice and understand that justice is not about identity, it's about ethics, that we should carry wherever we were. And we needed to start prioritizing our issues differently and understanding that. I think this is something that Canadians have lacked in terms of having these role models that African Americans have been for us, this challenging voice that African Americans were for American Muslims. But I do think that there's an opportunity. I think there's a great opportunity right now, and this is something that I've been saying for many years. It's why I have my, raggedy copy. My dog chewed the cover, literally. The dog ate my homework. Well, the dog actually bit this book. I don't know if he liked it very much, but the issue of Indigenous issues, First Nation issues in Canada, I think can provide for the Muslim community a kind of mirror through which we could see our own, whether our idea that Islam is just, our statement and our retort that Islam is about justice really holds water. Whether it's really a value and an ethic that we embrace, or whether it's simply about us and them, about identity politics. It's an issue that has been, of course, important in Canada for a long time. But now, there's so many more resources because there are many more people who are talking about it. There's a lot of information available. There are people who are reaching out in the First Nations, Aboriginal community, who are helping us understand. But this is the issue about Canada. If you asked, what is the Canadian Islam that we want? What is the Canada that we're trying to be part of? And this is where really it's a question of what is the soil? What are we rooting ourselves into? If you ask a French Canadian, it's going to be very different. There's going to be a very different response than an English Canadian to what Canadian identity means and what it means really to be a Canadian. And the French Canadians will have a slight problem with the history of the English in Canada also. And then, of course, if we look at Indigenous or First Nations people, it will be a much more serious challenge. I grew up in Kitchener. I wasn't born there. I was actually born in Kingston, but just this for the record in case it's completely irrelevant. I feel I have to correct the record. So I grew up in Kitchener. Now, I knew in Kitchener, where I grew up, almost everyone was German, with a few Irish, and then of course there were also the Portuguese who lived in the more poor section of town who we thought were really crazy for the fact that they planted their gardens in the front yard rather than the back. I mean, in our Platonic universe, everyone knows gardens, vegetable gardens, go in the backyard, and front yards are just for people to walk by. And no one should be sitting in the front yard, affronting those poor people who are walking down the street minding their own business, actually looking at them or engaging with them, saying hello. So that was my first understanding a little bit of cultural differences. But I didn't really know much about where I came from, and I think it's this history that's not taught that is a huge problem for us. The history of my city wasn't taught. Somehow when I got older, I eventually heard that my city used to be named something else. It was actually named Berlin. And I remember the first time I was talking to someone who happened to be Sudanese, and he said, well, where are you from in Canada? And I said, Kitchener. His mouth dropped open. Does anyone know what Kitchener did in Sudan? Kitchener killed about 30,000 Sudanese and ordered the unearthing of the grave of the Mahdi, who was considered to be a great, righteous leader by many of the Sudanese. So Kitchener was this English general. Now, why was my town, my city, why did it change its name from Berlin to Kitchener? World War I. And the Germans who were living in Berlin when World War I came around were suddenly looked at as a fifth column. They were attacked, businesses were broken into, vandalized, people were beat up, until finally there was a vote taken, and of course not everyone was asked or consulted or allowed to vote. But it ended up with the conclusion that the bust of the Kaiser was thrown in the pond, a statue of Queen Victoria was erected, that's Victoria Park now, for those of you from Kitchener-Waterloo area, and the city was renamed Kitchener. Now, when I read about Kitchener, and I realized why my Sudanese friend was so appalled at the name of my city, I thought, of all the names, if we didn't want to be associated with the Germans, why the hell would we want to be associated with Kitchener? Who was known explicitly for putting down the rebellion of the Sudanese. What were they rebelling against? Well, British rule of their country, right? But that adopting an identity, deliberately, consciously adopting one identity to affiliate with the dominant power, but an identity that shows, an identity that makes it very clear that there still is an enemy. We may be a little bit different, but we're still with you against them, is a big problem. And it is part of our heritage. It's part of my heritage, as a Canadian, as someone who grew up in that town, whose roots are in that, primarily in that German community. So when we talk about adopting a Canadian Muslim identity or rooting a Canadian Muslim identity, we have to keep the conversation open about what Canada is. And that's an eminently Canadian thing to do. I mean, anyone who's grown up in Canada knows that conversations about what is Canada, what is a Canadian identity, what does it really mean to be Canadian is almost, nauseatingly repeated on CBC and discussion shows and ideas and all of these great Canadian shows, right? But it's an issue of concern, but sometimes it's an issue of concern that has to do often with the United States. When I was growing up, it really was about how different are we from the United States. And that was really important. We wanted to be different. We wanted to know that we were not like the US. We were more peaceful, we were more kind, we were more polite, whatever characteristics we had. But there's deeper issues. And so I think part of rooting Muslims in a healthy way in Canada is to have Muslims engaged in this discussion about what is Canadian identity. What is our history? What has been the good part and the bad part? And Canadian Muslims need to be, like other Canadians, able to say, there are parts of this identity and history that I find repulsive or problematic, and there are parts of it that I can embrace. And being a Canadian means I'm going to claim that and continue to be involved in the discussion of what these values are. One of the reasons why I love John Ralston's Saul book, A Fair Country, is that he talks about Aboriginal views of community, of justice, as being more amenable to expanding to allow more and more people in. And I think the reality is that if Canadian Muslims are trying to squeeze ourselves always into a kind of Anglo-Canadian or even French-Canadian identity, justifying ourselves in those terms, those cultural terms, it'll be problematic. It'll always be a little bit of an awkward fit. we should examine this third founding identity, in fact, the original founding identity. And I think if we do that, we'll find that there are values and practices and beliefs that are often more amenable to us as Muslims. Now, why haven't Muslims rushed to do that before? I think the reason why we haven't rushed to do that is that we don't want to affiliate ourselves with an oppressed people. We're trying to get in with and we want to be privileged like everyone else, right? So this is why we want to present our identity in terms of Judeo-Christian or Abrahamic. I remember many years ago, Dr. Abdullah and I were talking about that and came up with this phrase that he then wrote into a paper, the Abrahamic box. So we squeeze ourselves into the Abrahamic box. Well, Islam is pre-Abrahamic. And if we look at Islam as the fitra religion, the religion that is the natural state of human beings, it is something that is not only boxed in by the Abrahamic tradition. The Abrahamic tradition is important and it's Quranic, but we don't have to box ourselves into that. There's something deeper, primordial, foundational in Islamic beliefs that should make us be able to open our eyes and look at that. But for the same reasons that immigrant Muslims in America did not try to kind of avoid the African American community and look to the suburbs and look to sort of the successful group, in a way try to enter white America. And, you know, if you're of Middle Eastern origin in the census of the United States, it says white, including people of Middle Eastern origin, but that comes from the Jewish community. Our Jewish brothers and sisters made sure that they were included in the white category. And so no matter how dark you are, if you're a very dark-skinned Arab, you still, you know, will check off the white box. It's absurd, but it also goes to this need to affiliate with the dominant class. But if we want to be Muslim, if being Muslim, if our identity means living our values and our beliefs, should we be always trying to get in with the most privileged people if the system that they've established is one that's not just, that's not fair? Or does our identity, do we go and look instead at another form of what I might call counterculturalism? Because there is this, you know, in a lot of Muslims, there is this kind of countercultural reaction, you know, and sometimes it can be directed in this negative way, anti-Western, anti-white, you know, I'm not getting involved in this establishment. But there's also a positive counterculturalism that says, look, the world needs to be fixed, it needs to be healed, it needs to be repaired. It's the counterculturalism of Uwais al-Qarni, a great figure, a great spiritual figure in Islam, who the Prophet Muhammad talked about as a great person who lived with the poor and the oppressed. And whenever he prayed, his prayer was responded to. But he didn't leave a legacy that was known by the people in power. So the countercultural aspect or tendency or the sort of impulse of Muslims to be skeptical of power is fine, but what we need to do is to direct it in the way that is effective and that is just and is not about identity, but really is about values. I mean, if we think about it, in our time, you know, what are some of the most countercultural actions that can be taken? And when I look at it, I see that there are so many needs in society that we can address in partnership with others so that we are looking and really addressing systematic injustice, but in a way that is not about our identity, but about really addressing the issues of injustice really about bringing compassionate love and mercy into society, but not in opposition to another dichotomous group, but in partnership and solidarity with others. You know, if you think about things like a persistent theme in the Quran and in Islamic tradition is the idea of privacy and the right of people to be able to have their own space, their own private space, their own domestic space, their own community space where they can live in a way together as a family, as a community that may be different from others, but that retains that the state can't intervene in, that others can't probe, that as long as the people in these spheres are not causing harm in the public, that they have a right to that privacy. We live right now in a security state, in a surveillance state, in a state of constant scrutiny. Here's something that is a true Islamic value, I would say, that has been undermined and many other people are concerned about. You know, there are many other issues, like the economic issues, the issues about the environment, just horrible commercialization of our common resources. Islamic law is very clear that there are resources, natural resources are held in common for the sake of the benefit of the community. In this way, it almost completely parallels the traditions of Aboriginal people. We should be all over that issue. And if we were, we would be literally rooted in the land. I mean, that's rooting. If you know your water, you know your land, you know your woods, you are going to feel at home. Because when you get tired of people, you know, when you get frustrated with people, there's nothing like being in God's creation to make you feel, you know, not only in touch with the world, but also in touch with God. I actually gave up on when I was an Islamic studies teacher for middle school in a suburban Chicago middle school and high school. Eventually, I just threw the books out and I took them to the woods every week because they were so. The cultural challenges, the ideological, emotional, psychological challenges were so much that what they really needed was just to get back in touch with God through nature. And that was, we had to go back and kind of like build that soil for rooting, build that pure, clean, wholesome soil. And then they could start to talk about what institutions they would build and community and what they would do. But they needed that wholesome base. I know I can't go on forever, so I want to say one final thing. You know, it used to be before the Arab Spring, I would say, that Canadian Muslims and American Muslims who were trying to bring our communities forward we would often find ourselves in a way apologizing for the actions of our brothers and sisters in Muslim countries. You know, people would ask us, what are those crazy Muslims in that country doing, or why do they do this, and we would say, well, that's not really Islam, those issues are cultural, political, and these were all true justifications, but we were trying for a long time, I would say, to really carve a space for ourselves away from them so we wouldn't be dragged down by their political issues all the time, but we would be able to look around and see what we were doing. Now, I remember when the Arab Spring happened, then a lot of us started pointing to the TV screens and saying, well, look, there's 80 million Egyptians who are advocating for freedom and democracy, so that's proof that Islam can support, you know, democracy and people don't want dictatorship. So it became a good proof for us, maybe. But more importantly, I think now there's an opportunity for all of us in the fact that we used to talk about the Muslim world and then the non-Muslim world, or Muslim majority countries and Muslims as minorities. But what's happening now as a result of democratic movements in Muslim majority countries is that Muslims themselves are starting to say, well, are we a Muslim country? Do we want to be an Islamic state? How are we, even if we're in positions of power, we still have to face the issue of religious diversity, of pluralism within Islam, that there are Muslims who have different ideas about what Islam is. And, you know, what are we going to do for our country in terms of identity? How do we identify ourselves? And there are some really interesting and important conversations that are being had in these countries. And I'll just give you one example. I was in Tunis a couple months ago through my former leadership of the Islamic Society of North America. We felt that it was really important a few years ago to raise the issue of the position of religious minorities in Muslim majority countries. We felt that it was our ethical responsibility for a number of reasons, one of which is that we as religious minorities are enjoying, you know, the benefits of religious freedom, and it hurt us to see religious minorities, you know, primarily Christians in Muslim majority countries, not enjoying the same freedom that we had. And this feeling that our ethics required reciprocity, and also that we had valuable experience to share with our brothers and sisters in Muslim majority countries, to show them that you can live in an environment that is religiously diverse and plural, and things aren't going to fall apart. There are still observant, you know, Muslim communities here who are following Islam, so that this doesn't necessarily, it may present a challenge, but it's a challenge that you can meet and sometimes even grow beyond. So at the conference in Tunis, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayah, who many of you know, a great global scholar of Islam, a really deep thinker, presented just an amazing paper, very rich, very deep on the issue of citizenship. And I think here, someone like him can take Muslim communities out of this identity dilemma. Because one of the things that he did was to distinguish citizenship from nationalism. We all know that nationalism can be extremely problematic, and for most of the 20th century was. Nationalism is exclusive, and especially when it's an ethnic nationalism. You know, whether it's the ethnic nationalism of Germany, and that resulted in the Nazi atrocities, or whether it's the ethnic nationalism of modern Turkey that meant the suppression of the Kurdish people. And we could go on and on. So nationalism has been problematic, and much of the Muslim world, nationalism has been associated also with secularism, or secularity, let's say, and a very vigorous kind of a vigorous application or imposition of secularity. But what he talked about is that there's a big difference between nationalism and citizenship, and that citizenship is something that is required in Islam, good citizenship, and in fact is part of the founding message. So he explored and talked about what the contract of Medina meant. Now, many of you know, many of you have heard about the contract of Medina, the covenant of Medina, which was the agreement that the Prophet Muhammad and the Muslims made when they came to the city of Yathrib that became known as Medina, with the inhabitants there. And this said that they are, the believers and the Jews are one community. The Jews have their religion and the believers have theirs. So this is very clear, this is just a summary, epitome of it, because we don't have much time to go into it. But there is the idea of an ummah, and Muslims love to talk about the ummah, the Muslim ummah, the Muslim ummah. Yes, there's a Muslim ummah, but there's also your political ummah, where you live. Where you live is also a community. And so this shows that at the founding of Islam, the importance of having a community that is based in a place, in a location, that involves citizenship, involves living together, sharing common interests, common resources, defending each other, but also having religious freedom. This is such an important model But if this model does not replace the existing story that's being told about the early Muslim community, we're going to continue to have identity problems. Because the existing story that's told about the early Muslim community is one of the believers against the unbelievers. And I challenge any of you to go to any of the Islamic schools and look at the curriculum on Islamic history, the life of the Prophet in Mecca and Medina. And almost all of this is framed in a way of before Islam and after Islam. The Jahiliyyah, the period of ignorance, and the period of Islam. And it's about the pagans versus the believer, the believing Muslims. This is the dichotomous worldview that Sayyid Qutb set in motion in the 20th century that has permeated almost all of Islamic teachings and the view of Islamic political history and identity. And I don't believe that most Muslims believe it, but we're bound with this story. This is still the story that's being told. At the same time that people aren't living it. You know, the living reality is that most Muslims are engaging and being good citizens and living, embracing pluralism, yet they're stuck. We're stuck with this narrative or this story of what community means, what Muslim identity means in terms of where we live, that is constantly calling us towards a really lower level and a divisive identity. And it's not allowing us at the same time, if it doesn't drag us down, it's not allowing us to see the opportunities that are available for connection, for relationship, for what I like to talk about as overlapping circles of community. Because if you think of Ummah as a community, as a circle of community, you have the overlapping circle of your religious community and your political community. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's very different than a dichotomous worldview, a box that's divided in two parts, the believers and the unbelievers, the Muslims and the non-Muslims. So I'm optimistic about the possibility of a strong, rich, vibrant Canadian Muslim identity. I think we have a lot of work to do, though, and the work is on the implementation of it in terms of the books that are given to children, the stories that we tell to children about ourselves, about our history, the what's said in the mosques, and then really having those opportunities to engage. I went, a few weeks ago when the I Don't Know More movement first broke out, I went to Ottawa because I wanted to witness what was happening and to show an act of solidarity. And it was very moving to me going to the Ottawa main mosque. I really just went to visit my student, but he gathered a whole bunch of people who showed up when I came there, and we had a great conversation for about 3 hours about why Muslims, Canadian Muslims, and most of them were from Egypt and Pakistan and other places, why they should care at all about this movement, and what would have united them. And then we went down to Chief Teresa Spence's camp, and I just watched, it was so interesting to see how moved some of the imams were by what they saw, and how at home they felt. They felt really at home with the dynamic there, the way people were, how they were speaking, how they were treating each other. And I'm very excited about the possibility, because of the hospitality and the eagerness of so many of the young people in this movement to help educate other Canadians, that this is really an opportunity, I think, for many Muslim Canadians to feel that, you know what, there is a narrative of Canadian history that we can understand, that we can identify with. It's not our own, we can't co-opt it, we can't appropriate for ourselves, but we can say, we can be in solidarity and also see our identity unfold in parallel as they as their future unfolds and as they seek their future in this context of Canada that is constantly changing politically and economically. I've gone on far too long. I apologize for that. Thank you for your attention, and we may have time for a few questions.